A cuneiform tablet sits in a museum drawer for decades before anyone realizes what it actually says. It isn't damaged, it isn't lost. It's simply one artifact among hundreds of thousands pulled from the ground in southern Iraq, filed away, cataloged, and left waiting for someone with the right expertise to notice it. When a historian of science finally sits down to translate it properly in the 1950s, the recipe pressed into the clay is unmistakable. Fat, ash, water, specific proportions. The oldest soap formula ever recorded by human hands. But there's a detail buried in that translation that upends the assumption almost everyone carries into this story without ever examining it. This recipe was never meant to touch a single human body. Not a hand, not a face, not once. Ask most people today where soap came from, and the honest answer is that they've never thought about it at all. It's simply present, on the edge of a sink, in a shower caddy, in a pump bottle by a kitchen faucet, background infrastructure so constant barely registers as something with an origin story worth knowing. But every one of those bottles is the end product of a chain of decisions, accidents, and borrowed techniques stretching back nearly 5,000 years. Through civilizations that had almost nothing else in common with each other, each one adding a piece to a puzzle none of them could see the full shape of. For most of human history, soap wasn't invented to make anyone clean. It was invented to make something else. Wool, cloth, dye, usable. The idea of rubbing it on skin came centuries later, borrowed reluctantly, resisted by entire empires, and in some periods actively avoided for hundreds of years at a stretch. The story of soap is not a straight, tidy line from filth to hygiene. It's a story about a chemical reaction humans stumbled into essentially by accident, misapplied for well over 1,000 years, mythologized by writers who got the origin badly wrong, and only slowly, reluctantly. Pointed at the human body, it now exists almost entirely to clean. So what's actually sitting in that clay drawer, and why did it take so long for anyone to use the thing it described the way it's used today in nearly every bathroom on the planet? The tablet in question was uncovered at Tello, in southern Iraq, the site of the ancient Sumerian city of Girsu, once a thriving center of the Sumerian civilization that flourished in the marshy land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It had been resting in an archive for years, unremarkable to anyone without the specific training to read it, before Martin Levey, a historian of science who spent much of his career reconstructing the chemistry of the ancient Near East, sat down to translate it properly. What Levey found, and later published in his research on Babylonian and Mesopotamian chemistry, was not folklore. It was a formula, specific ratios of oil boiled together with wood ash, written with the same practical, procedural precision a modern recipe card might use. The tablet has been dated to roughly 2500 BCE. That date alone is worth sitting with for a moment, because numbers this large tend to blur together into a vague sense of very old, unless they're anchored to something concrete. 2,500 years before the Common Era. The Great Pyramid at Giza had already been standing for centuries by the time this recipe was pressed into wet clay. Writing itself, the cuneiform script used to record the formula, had only existed as a technology for a few hundred years, still a relatively new invention in human history. And somewhere in that river delta, someone had already worked out, entirely through empirical trial and observation, with no concept of atoms or molecules or chemical bonds, one of the most consequential reactions in the history of human health. But here is the detail that changes the entire shape of the story. This tablet has nothing to do with bathing. The recipe wasn't written for washing bodies. It was written for washing wool. To understand why that distinction matters, it helps to understand what raw wool actually is before anyone processes it. Wool comes off a sheep saturated in lanolin, a thick, waxy grease the animal's skin produces naturally, functioning as a kind of biological raincoat. That grease serves the sheep well. It's a serious obstacle for a weaver. Wool still coated in lanolin resists dye unevenly, clumps rather than spins cleanly, and produces a lower quality finished textile. Before a single thread of Mesopotamian cloth could be dyed a rich, saleable color for temple use or long-distance trade, someone had to strip that grease out first, thoroughly and reliably. And it turns out the exact chemical reaction that accomplishes that, stripping grease cleanly off raw wool fiber, is the same reaction that several thousand years and multiple civilizations later would end up bottled by every bathroom sink on the planet. The Sumerians weren't thinking about hygiene when they perfected this recipe. They were solving a textile production problem. Human hygiene was a side effect nobody had connected to the the formula yet. Not for a very long time. So what is actually happening, chemically, inside that boiling pot of fat and ash? This is worth explaining properly, because it's the part of soap's history that almost never gets laid out clearly, and it's the part that makes every later chapter of this story make sense. Wood ash, mixed with water, produces a mildly caustic solution, what chemists today would classify as an alkali or a base. Ancient chemists had no such vocabulary. The concept of chemistry as a formal discipline didn't exist yet. But functionally, that's precisely what they were working with. A substance chemically opposite to an acid, capable of breaking other molecular structures apart under the right conditions. Fat, meanwhile, is built from molecules called triglycerides, 3 long fatty acid chains, each bonded to a central glycerol backbone like 3 ropes tied off to a single central post. When alkaline ash water is heated together with that fat, the alkali attacks the chemical bonds holding those 3 fatty acid ropes onto the glycerol post. Under sustained heat, the bonds break. The fatty acids come loose from the glycerol entirely, and as they separate, they immediately bond instead with the alkali itself, forming a brand new kind of molecule, one with 2 strikingly different ends. One end of this new molecule is drawn to water, the other end is repelled by water and instead clings tightly to grease and oil. That double-natured molecule is soap. The overall reaction is called saponification, a term that traces back to the same linguistic root as the Latin word sapo, which surfaces much later in this story in a very different context. That 2-faced molecular structure is the entire trick, the whole mechanism the rest of this story depends on. Grease and water do not naturally mix. Anyone who has ever tried rinsing an oily pan under a cold tap has already learned this the hard way, purely by instinct. But a soap molecule bridges the two. It grabs onto grease with one end and grabs onto water with the other, and in doing so, it drags the grease physically along with it, out of raw wool fiber, off a hand, off a plate, off a wound. Nothing mystical is happening. A single molecule has simply been shaped to connect 2 substances that otherwise flatly refuse to cooperate with each other. It's worth being precise about scale here, because boiling fat with ash sounds almost too simple to be the origin of something this consequential. The specific alkali at work in wood ash is potassium carbonate, leached out of the ash when mixed with water, a compound present in relatively low concentration compared to the industrially manufactured lye used in soap production today. That's part of why early soap, including the Sumerian formula, would have produced a soft, almost paste-like result rather than a firm bar, closer in texture to a thick, greasy gel than to anything recognizable on a modern store shelf. Firm, solid bars wouldn't become reliably achievable until soap makers, centuries later, gained access to stronger, more concentrated alkalis and more consistent processing techniques. The Sumerians weren't failing at making a bar of soap. A bar of soap, in the modern sense, simply wasn't the target. A cleaning solution that lifted grease from wool fiber was the entire goal, and on that measure, the formula worked precisely as intended. The Sumerians had no access to any of this, in molecular terms, of course. What they had was purely empirical, accumulated knowledge. Boil this fat with this ash in roughly these proportions for roughly this long, and the wool comes out measurably cleaner and takes dye more evenly. That knowledge, refined generation after generation through nothing but repeated observation and adjustment, stands as one of the earliest documented instances of applied chemistry in the entire archaeological record, centuries before anyone anywhere had a word for chemistry at all. But what did the absence of this reaction applied to the body rather than to wool actually cost people? For the thousands of years before anyone made that connection, this is worth pausing on, because it's easy to treat this story as a purely academic curiosity about textiles and timelines, when the underlying stakes were closer to life and death. For nearly the entire span of human history, a relatively minor wound could become a serious, sometimes fatal, medical event. Not because of the wound itself, but because of what grew inside it afterward. Infection, driven by bacteria thriving in unwashed conditions, was a constant and largely unaddressed threat across the ancient world, a threat that predates any understanding of what bacteria even were by thousands of years. Physicians across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later Greece and Rome developed elaborate systems of wound care involving honey, wine, various plant extracts, and ritual practices, precisely because they were grasping, empirically and often blindly, at anything that seemed to reduce the terrifying unpredictability of a wound turning fatal days after the original injury had already started healing. Here's the genuinely unsettling part. The mechanism that would eventually explain why washing mattered, the germ theory of disease, connecting invisible microorganisms to infection and illness, was still roughly 4,000 years away from formal articulation when that Sumerian tablet was pressed into clay. Nobody boiling fat with ash in Girsu had any concept that they were sitting on a technology capable of meaningfully reducing infection risk. They just knew wool came out cleaner. The life-saving application of the exact same molecule was sitting right there, chemically speaking, the entire time, completely invisible to the civilizations holding it, simply because nobody yet had the conceptual framework to notice it. But the story doesn't stay contained in Mesopotamia for long. It moves west, along trade routes and cultural contact zones, and it picks up a second thread almost as old as the first. Around 1550 BC, roughly 1,000 years after that Sumerian tablet was pressed into clay, a sprawling medical text was compiled in Egypt, a document modern scholars call the Ebers Papyrus, named for the German Egyptologist who acquired it in the 19th century. It stands today as one of the most complete surviving windows into how ancient Egyptian medicine actually functioned in daily practice. Buried among its long list of remedies for ailments ranging from digestive complaints to skin conditions is a formula combining both animal and vegetable oils with alkaline salts, described as useful for cleansing and, notably, for treating certain skin ailments directly. The Ebers Papyrus itself is worth describing in a little more detail, because its scale alone says something about how seriously Egyptian medicine treated the systematic recording of remedies. The scroll runs to more than 20 meters in length once fully unrolled, containing hundreds of individual prescriptions covering ailments from digestive disorders to eye disease to, in this case, skin conditions requiring a cleansing agent. It isn't a single author's personal notebook. It reads more like a compiled reference work, likely drawing on generations of accumulated Egyptian medical practice that existed long before the papyrus itself was physically written down around 1550 BCE. The soap-adjacent formula sits there not as a standalone curiosity, but as one entry among hundreds, filed alongside remedies that modern readers would recognize as genuinely sophisticated for their era, and others that read as pure ritual incantation, a reminder that ancient medicine rarely drew the sharp line between empirical treatment and religious practice that modern medicine insists on today. Here is a pattern worth pausing on, because it raises a genuinely interesting question. Why would the same basic substance show up in two separate civilizations, roughly 1,000 years apart, being used for two entirely different purposes? The tempting explanation is that the idea simply traveled, fully formed, from Sumer down into Egypt through trade contact. But the more interesting possibility, and the one most historians of ancient chemistry actually favor, is that the underlying reaction is simple enough, and the raw ingredients common enough, that multiple cultures plausibly stumbled into some version of it independently, through the same basic accidents any household hearth fire produces. Fat renders and drips near a cooking fire. Ash sits close by, left over from that same fire. Rain falls, or a pot spills, or a curious hand mixes the two together out of idle habit. The overwhelming majority of those small accidents produced nothing worth remembering. A tiny fraction produced something slippery, foamy, and useful enough that someone, somewhere, decided to deliberately repeat it. But before moving further west, it's worth pausing on a question that a purely chronological telling of this story tends to skip past too quickly. If the underlying chemistry is genuinely this simple, fat, ash, heat, available to virtually any culture with a hearth fire, why didn't soap making become universal far sooner than it did? Why did entire regions of the ancient world, with equally sophisticated craft traditions and equally consistent access to animal fat and wood ash, apparently never develop it at all, or develop it and never write it down? Part of the answer is almost certainly the gap between accident and repeatable procedure. Producing a usable, effective soap isn't simply a matter of any fat meeting any ash under any conditions. The alkalinity has to fall within a fairly specific range, too weak, and the reaction barely proceeds, too caustic, and the resulting product burns skin and destroys the very fibers it was meant to clean. Getting from an accidental slippery residue near a cooking fire to a genuinely reliable, repeatable formula worth writing down on a clay tablet required exactly the kind of patient. Structured trial and error the Sumerians happened to apply to their textile industry specifically, because textile production, unlike casual household cleaning, was economically important enough to justify that sustained investment of effort. Wool wasn't a minor domestic convenience in ancient Sumer, it was a major export commodity, tied directly to the wealth of temples and palaces. That economic pressure, more than any purely scientific curiosity, is very likely what pushed the formula from occasional lucky accident into documented standardized procedure in the first place. That's a pattern worth flagging directly. Because it recurs throughout the rest of this story, soap's major leaps forward rarely came from someone setting out purely to invent better hygiene. They came from someone solving an entirely different, usually economic, problem, with hygiene arriving afterward as an unplanned bonus. Egypt is also where this story starts bending, for the first time, towards something resembling genuine cultural obsession with cleanliness, though notably still not primarily through soap in the form recognized today. Egyptian hygiene culture, extensively documented through papyri, tomb paintings, and surviving physical artifacts, leaned heavily instead on a substance called natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt, mined from dry lake beds in a region still called the Wadi Natron. Natron served an almost bewildering range of purposes across Egyptian daily and religious life, as a drying agent essential to the entire mummification process, as an early form of toothpaste and mouth rinse, as a ritual purifier that temple priests were required to wash with before entering sacred spaces, and, critically for this story, as a cleansing agent when blended directly with oil, functioning as a kind of proto-soap that could lift grease from skin without ever undergoing true saponification. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later during his travels through Egypt, documented the use of natron in embalming in enough procedural detail that modern scholars still debate the precise translation of his description. What's clear from the surviving textual and archaeological record is that Egyptian hygiene wasn't organized around soap as its central technology, the way modern hygiene culture is. It was organized around a wider toolkit, oils, natron, ritual washing, of which soap-like formulas were only one part, and a relatively minor one, existing mostly in the medical rather than the daily bathing sphere. But why did the Egyptians go to such extraordinary, almost obsessive lengths around cleanliness in the first place, if soap specifically wasn't the centerpiece of that obsession? The answer has less to do with practical hygiene as it's understood today, and more to do with theology. Temple inscriptions surviving from this period describe priests undergoing mandatory natron washing before they were permitted to enter sacred spaces at all, cleanliness functioning not as a health measure but as a precondition for approaching the divine. Funerary texts describe the recently deceased being ritually cleansed with the salt of divine origin, language that frames the substance as spiritually transformative rather than merely detergent. To apply natron to a body, whether living or dead, was understood as an act of aligning that body with cosmic order itself, a concept Egyptian religious texts refer to as mat, and driving out the chaos and decay associated with its opposite. This matters for the larger story, because it reveals something important about how ancient cultures actually approached the question of cleanliness. It wasn't a single, universal, self-evident goal that every civilization pursued the same way, using whatever tools were chemically available. It was filtered, every time, through that specific culture's own framework for what cleanliness even meant and what purpose it served, medical in one place, theological in another, cosmetic in a third. Soap, as a specific chemical substance, had to wait for a civilization that happened to frame cleanliness in a way that made soap the obvious tool for the job. Egypt, despite an intense cultural focus on purity, wasn't quite that civilization yet. It's a useful corrective to a very modern instinct, the assumption that once a useful technology exists, its most obvious application inevitably follows close behind. Natron sat in Egyptian temples and tombs for well over a millennium, doing real cleansing work, without ever fully converging with the fat and alkali soap tradition developing in parallel in Mesopotamia. Two civilizations, trading with each other, aware of each other, each holding half of what would eventually become a single unified technology, and neither one fully closing that gap for a very long time. which brings this story to a civilization most people, if asked to guess, would assume was thoroughly obsessed with soap and were emphatically not. Picture the great Roman baths, the massive communal bathhouses that anchored urban social life across the entire Roman Empire, from the edges of Britain to the coast of North Africa. Steam rooms, cold plunge pools, elaborate architecture engineered specifically around the daily ritual of getting clean. Entire afternoons of civic life organized around the bathing schedule. If any ancient civilization was going to make soap the centerpiece of hygiene, surely, logically, it would be this one. It didn't happen that way. Romans overwhelmingly did not use soap to bathe. Instead, bathers coated their entire body in olive oil, then scraped that oil along with the dirt, sweat, and dead skin it had lifted from the surface, off using a curved metal implement called a strigil. Attendants at the baths and wealthier Romans' personal slaves performed this scraping ritual as a matter of routine. Public bathhouses across the empire were full of soaking, oiling, scraping, and sweating. Soap, specifically as a bathing product applied to skin the way it's understood today, was nearly absent from that entire routine for centuries. Consider what that actually meant in practice. Inside one of those enormous bath complexes, a bather moved through a sequence of rooms, each engineered around a different water temperature. A hot room, the caldarium, to open the pores and loosen grime. A warm room, the tepidarium, to ease the transition. A cold plunge, the frigidarium, to close things back up at the end. Somewhere in that sequence, oil went on, the strigil came out, and the scraping began, a physically effortful process, often performed by someone else entirely, leaving faint parallel lines on the skin that archaeologists have identified on surviving depictions in Roman art. It was, by any reasonable definition, an elaborate hygiene technology. It simply wasn't soap's hygiene technology. An empire capable of engineering aqueducts, hypocaust underfloor heating, and some of the most sophisticated urban water infrastructure in the ancient world looked directly at soap-adjacent Gaulish techniques on its own frontier, and largely declined to adopt them for centuries. So where then does the word for soap itself, sapo, the direct linguistic ancestor of the modern English word, actually come from, if not from, Roman bathing culture? This is where the story runs headlong into one of its most persistent and stubborn myths, and it's worth debunking properly, because the myth has survived in popular retellings for centuries. And the real answer turns out to be more interesting than the legend it replaces. The popular version of the story goes roughly like this. There was, supposedly, a hill near Rome called Mount Sapo, where animals were ritually sacrificed on a regular basis. Rain would wash the rendered fat from those sacrifices, mixed together with wood ash from the sacrificial fires, down the hillside and into the clay banks of the river Tiber below. There, according to the legend, ancient laundresses discovered a strange, sudsy substance clinging to the riverbank clay that made washing dramatically easier, and named both the substance and the hill after the same word. It's a genuinely wonderful story. It also appears, on closer historical examination, to be almost entirely fabricated. Historians who have gone looking for solid evidence of an actual Mount Sapo have found essentially nothing. No confirmed geographic location matching the description, no corroborating ancient source independently describing the site as real. Nothing beyond the legend endlessly repeating itself through later retellings, each one citing the last. The scale problem alone should raise immediate suspicion for anyone thinking carefully about it. The volume of fat produced by occasional ceremonial animal sacrifice is nowhere close to enough to plausibly wash down a hillside in soap, producing quantities on any kind of regular, exploitable basis. The real origin of the word turns out to be quieter and considerably less cinematic. Linguists tracing the etymology of Sapo point not to a mythical hill but to an early Germanic or Celtic language root closely connected to the Latin word sebum, meaning tallow or rendered animal fat. In other words, the word for soap and the word for one of its two basic raw ingredients appear to share a common linguistic ancestor. That's a far less dramatic explanation than a sacrificial mountain with a river running red and greasy beneath it. It also happens to be the explanation the actual evidence supports, and that etymology points directly toward exactly who the Romans themselves, in their own writing, credited with soap's invention. Writing in the 1st century CE, the Roman scholar and encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, in his sprawling, genuinely enormous compendium of the known world, Natural History, describes Sapo explicitly as an invention of the Gauls, the Celtic peoples occupying what is now France and parts of Western Europe. Pliny even records a working formula, tallow combined with ash, with the finest results, he claims, coming specifically from beechwood ash mixed with goat fat, available in both solid and liquid forms depending on preparation. But notice carefully what Pliny says this substance was actually used for. Not bathing. Hair, specifically, giving hair a fashionable reddish tint. Pliny even adds, with a faint note of Roman cultural condescension creeping into his prose, that among Germanic peoples, men reportedly used the substance more often than women did, treated by Roman writers as a slightly ridiculous foreign vanity product, not remotely as a hygiene essential. Pliny does mention one other application. Almost in passing, soap used to treat what he describes as scrofulous sores, a reference to swollen, infected lymph nodes, often tuberculosis-related, that would have been a visible and fairly common ailment across the ancient Mediterranean world. It's a fleeting, secondary mention, buried in a passage mostly concerned with hair dye. But it's also, quietly, one of the earliest surviving Western references connecting this substance to actual wound or skin treatment rather than cosmetics or textiles, a thread that wouldn't be picked up seriously again for centuries, and not by Rome. So, by the 1st century of the Common Era, soap has existed in some recognizable form for well over 2,000 years, and it still has not become what it is today. It has been a textile treatment in Mesopotamia, a medicinal salve folded into a much broader hygiene toolkit in Egypt, a hair dye viewed with mild amusement among the Gauls. Everything, in other words, except the things sitting on a bathroom sink in the present day. That transformation happens somewhere else entirely. And this is where the real turn in soap's story takes place, though it isn't the kind of turn a simpler telling might expect. The shift begins, gradually and cumulatively, in the cities of the medieval Islamic world, and it's important to be precise about what kind of change this actually was. It wasn't a single dramatic breakthrough, one inventor, one eureka moment. It was a steady, centuries-long process of technical refinement, proof that soap's evolution from crude ash and fat paste into something resembling a modern bar wasn't ancient genius followed immediately by modern perfection. It was a long, patient accumulation of small improvements, each one building carefully on the last. Across generations of craftspeople whose individual names have mostly been lost to history, apart from the handful documented by chroniclers of the period. In the city of Nablus, a city historians and medieval geographers writing at the time situated within the broader region known as the Levant, a soap-making tradition took root that would eventually make the city's product genuinely famous across the medieval trading world. The 10th century geographer al-Maqdisi, whose surviving accounts of the region remain a key source for historians studying this period, documented local women in Nablus producing soap by combining virgin olive oil, water, and an alkaline sodium compound, working with techniques passed down and refined within specific families and workshops. Around that same period, the physician and alchemist al-Tamimi described detailed techniques for producing concentrated potash, a purified, powerful alkali, by burning specific desert plants under controlled conditions, refining the alkali side of the soap, making equation into something far more consistent and far more controllable than raw, unpredictable wood ash had ever managed to be. This is a critical technical leap, and it's genuinely easy to miss if the story of soap gets told purely in terms of ingredients rather than process. Wood ash is inconsistent by its very nature. Its alkaline strength varies with the species of tree, the intensity of the burn, the specific batch, even the weather during collection. A soap maker working exclusively with wood ash is, in a very real sense, gambling with every single batch, never entirely certain of the final strength or quality. Concentrated, plant-derived alkali, refined and increasingly standardized through documented technique, turns soap making from an unpredictable folk craft into something approaching reliable, repeatable manufacturing. That one improvement, better, more consistent alkali, is arguably as historically important to soap's development as the original discovery of the saponification reaction itself, even though it rarely gets mentioned in popular retellings of soap's history. But is this really the moment chemistry as a discipline, rather than a scattered folk practice passed down by trial and error, actually starts applying itself to substances like soap? The surviving record suggests yes, and it's worth naming exactly who was doing that work, because their names tend to get left out of soap's popular history entirely. In 9th century Baghdad, the philosopher and polymath Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi authored a text known as the Book of the Chemistry of Perfume and Distillations, containing more than 100 documented recipes for fragrant oils, salves, and aromatic preparations, engineering specifications essentially, detailing exact materials, precise equipment dimensions, and controlled heating methods, rather than vague folk instruction. His descriptions cover how to seal joints on distillation equipment to prevent aromatic vapor from escaping, how to regulate heat by adjusting the physical distance between a flame and the vessel above it, and how to manage condensation to maximize the yield of a finished product. This is not the language of superstition or trial and error guesswork. It's the language of a trained experimentalist working with reproducible method. Al-Kindi was working within a broader scientific culture that included figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan, often credited as a foundational figure in the development of chemistry as a formal discipline, who perfected distillation techniques and a range of chemical processes, sublimation, crystallization, filtration, purification, that would go on to underpin centuries of subsequent chemical industry, including, eventually, standardized soap production. The historian Will Durant, writing much later in the 20th century, would go so far as to argue that chemistry as a rigorous science was essentially created within this intellectual tradition, crediting these scholars with introducing precise observation and controlled experimentation to a field the Greeks before them had largely left at the level of industrial habit and loose hypothesis. This was the same intellectual environment, the same cities, often the very same scholars, refining the alkali and oil combinations that would define Levantine soap for centuries afterward. Soap making wasn't developing in isolation during this period, often some separate craft tradition disconnected from formal learning. It was developing alongside, and often directly within, one of the most rigorous experimental scientific traditions of the medieval world, which goes a long way toward explaining why the soap coming out of Baghdad, Nablus, and Aleppo during this period was so measurably more refined and more consistent than anything Europe had yet managed to produce on its own. Roughly 200 kilometers north of Nablus, the city of Aleppo developed its own signature formula, one still recognizable and still produced today under essentially the same name. Olive oil formed the base. Laurel berry oil, pressed from the fruit of the bay laurel tree, was blended in at carefully guarded proportions. The mixture was combined with the region's now refined alkali and left to cure for months at a time, aging slowly from a vivid green on the inside to a deep golden brown by the time it was ready for use or trade. Aleppo soap wasn't yet a mass household commodity at this stage. Surviving trade records and later European accounts consistently describe it as a genuine luxury good, valuable enough to be gifted to European royalty, and carried westward by merchants and later by crusaders returning from campaigns in the Levant across the 11th through 13th centuries. That contact, trade routes, religious pilgrimage, and eventually armed conflict all funneling knowledge in the same westward direction is the hinge the rest of this entire story swings on. European soap making before this exchange was, by most surviving contemporary accounts, genuinely crude, heavily animal fat-based, harsh on skin, often unpleasant enough in smell and texture that it remained firmly a laundry product rather than something anyone would willingly choose to apply to their own face. What came back from the Levant, by contrast, was something meaningfully different, milder, built from refined plant oils rather than raw animal fat, deliberately formulated for use directly on skin rather than only on fabric. By the 14th century, according to surviving trade documentation, Nablus soap production had grown into a genuinely significant regional industry, with soap manufacturing centers flourishing not only there but across other Levantine cities, including Aleppo, Damascus, and Tripoli. Exported bars traveled remarkable distances for the period. Some historical accounts describe Nabulsi soap eventually reaching England, prized enough that it's reported to have been favored by Queen Elizabeth I, a striking image worth sitting with. A soap formula perfected by women artisans in a Levantine hill city, following a recipe first documented by a 10th century Arab geographer, eventually scenting the hands of an English monarch on the other side of the continent. Not a light drizzle of gradual influence, a sustained, centuries-long current of trade, translation, and adopted technique, flowing steadily from Baghdad and Nablus and Aleppo into the workshops of Marseille and Castile. each stop along the way refining the formula slightly further before passing it on. European soap-making guilds, concentrated in cities like Marseille and later in Venice and the Castile region of Spain, began adapting this olive oil-based approach over the following centuries, eventually producing what history remembers today as Castile soap, a name that still survives, largely unchanged. On ingredient labels in stores right now, a direct linguistic fossil of this centuries-old technical transfer from the Islamic world into medieval Europe. So here is the actual shape of this story's turn, and it's worth stating it plainly because it overturns an assumption most people carry into this topic without ever consciously examining it. Soap was not invented once by one culture for the exact purpose it now overwhelmingly serves. It was invented for laundry in Mesopotamia, driven by the practical demands of textile production. It was repurposed into a broader medical and ritual purity toolkit in Egypt alongside natron and oils. It was actively avoided as a bathing product by the empire most associated in popular imagination with elaborate hygiene rituals. It was mythologized, inaccurately, by Roman writers reaching for a satisfying origin story that the evidence doesn't actually support. And it was only finally refined through patient generations of craftspeople and documented chemists in the medieval Islamic world into something resembling the soap sitting in a bathroom today, refinements that then migrated into Europe through trade, pilgrimage, and conquest. The bar of soap resting on a sink right now isn't the tidy endpoint of one civilization's singular genius. It's the accumulated residue of at least 4 separate civilizations across roughly 4,000 years, solving 4 entirely different problems that all happened, almost by coincidence, to converge on the exact same molecule. There's a deeper irony sitting underneath this entire timeline, and it's worth surfacing clearly before closing the loop on where this story started. The reaction that makes soap possible, fat combined with alkali, combined with heat, producing a molecule capable of bridging water and grease, was available, in principle, to any culture on Earth with access to fire, animal fat, and ash. Which is to say, it was available at some basic level to nearly every human society that has ever existed, in nearly every inhabited region of the world. The ingredients were never rare. The underlying chemistry was never exotic or hidden behind some impossible technical barrier. What varied wildly across 5,000 years and multiple continents wasn't access to the reaction itself. It was entirely what each civilization decided, at that point in its history, the reaction was actually for. That's a genuinely strange thing to sit with for a moment. The barrier standing between much of humanity and reliable, health-protecting hygiene wasn't, for most of history, a shortage of the right raw materials. It was, again and again, a failure of imagination about what those readily available materials could actually be used for. Sumerian weavers held, quite literally in their hands, the exact chemical tool that would eventually help prevent countless infections and save an enormous number of lives, and they applied it, exclusively and without deviation, to sheep's wool for well over 1,000 years before anyone systematically pointed that same tool at the human body instead. We can't prove, with total historical certainty, exactly which individual first tried rubbing this substance on skin rather than wool, or exactly when or why. No surviving tablet records that specific moment of realization. It likely wasn't one moment at all, but a slow, uneven drift across cultures and centuries, adopted in one region while remaining unknown or actively avoided in another for hundreds of years longer. But the broader logic of the timeline holds together regardless of that missing detail. Every civilization examined here had equal chemical access to the same reaction. What separated them wasn't capability, it was purpose. And purpose, unlike chemistry, doesn't spread evenly or predictably across cultures. It has to be reinvented, city by city, almost from scratch, every single time. It raises an uncomfortable question that extends well beyond the history of soap specifically. How many other tools, sitting in plain view in front of any given civilization, in front of any civilization at all, go unused for their most important eventual purpose simply because nobody has yet made the connection? The gap between that Sumerian tablet in 2500 BC and reliable, medically informed. Soap-based hygiene reaching ordinary people across the world took literally thousands of years to close. And it didn't close because of one singular breakthrough moment, one brilliant individual, one eureka discovery. It closed because dozens of separate cultures, working largely independently across those centuries, Sumerian weavers, Egyptian physicians, Gaulish hairdressers, Nablus soap makers, Aleppo craftspeople, Marseille guild workers, each nudged the same underlying discovery a little closer to its eventual, now obvious use. And what does that accumulated 4,000-year journey actually amount to, measured against how the finished product gets used today? Consider the ordinary act of washing hands after using a restroom, or before a meal, or after handling raw meat. A reflex so automatic in much of the world now that it barely registers as a decision at all. That 30-second act is quietly drawing on the independent, hard-won labor of Sumerian textile workers who never once considered touching the substance to skin. Egyptian physicians working within an entirely different purification framework built around natron rather than true soap. A Roman encyclopedist who misattributed the product's cultural origin while accurately naming its Gaulish inventors, and Baghdad chemists whose engineering-grade precision with distillation and alkali production had nothing to do with hygiene as a stated goal and everything to do with perfecting a discipline. None of them were working toward that 30-second reflex on purpose. All of them, without knowing it, were building toward it anyway. Lay the whole timeline out in order, compressed into a single breath, and the sheer scale of it becomes almost dizzying. 2,500 years before the Common Era, in Girsu, a formula for washing wool. 1,550 years before the Common Era. In Egypt, a medical text folding a similar substance into remedies for the skin. The 1st century of the Common Era, in Rome, a misattributed legend about a sacred hill, alongside an accurate account crediting the Gauls. The 9th and 10th centuries, in Baghdad and Nablus, engineering-grade chemistry finally applied to the formula with real precision. The 11th through 13th centuries, crusaders and merchants carrying refined Levantine technique back into a Europe that had, until that point, been making something closer to crude tallow paste. 5,000 years, 6 named civilizations, and 1 single molecule, quietly getting better at its job the entire time without anyone ever fully controlling or directing that improvement from start to finish. The Sumerian weavers who first perfected that ash and fat recipe never knew, and had no possible way of knowing what their formula would eventually become. They were solving a specific, practical problem with a batch of wool on a specific afternoon, in a specific workshop, in a city that would eventually be conquered, buried, forgotten, and then carefully dug back out of the ground nearly 5,000 years later by archaeologists working with tools those original weavers could never have imagined. Somewhere in that buried city, sealed in clay, was a formula waiting patiently for someone to read it correctly. It took nearly 5,000 years. It took a historian in the 20th century sitting with a tablet under good light, finally translating a recipe meant for wool into a story about everyone who ever washed their hands without thinking twice about it.